Hi guys, I'm Jason White. This is my channel, Jason's Weird Reads, and this is my February and March wrap-up video. And the reason why I'm doing both months together is because, one, I'm really late with February, excuse me, and two, I didn't get too much reading done in March. My son, he came down with the flu. His cousin had it really bad for a while, about 2 weeks. And then my little guy got sick with it, and he pretty much, both of them, just passed it around the entire family. And I got sick and went to work sick, and then ended up cutting my finger because I wasn't really paying attention to something I had to cut. Ended up with 7 stitches. I lost a fair amount of blood, and let me tell you, that was really good for the system. I'm still kind of out of it, in case you haven't noticed. Alright, so February was Women in Horror Month, and I posted a video of my to-be-read list, everyone that's going to read. I had it all planned out, and then I didn't read any of it. Basically for me it was because other things came up. With the Darkness Dwells podcast, I decided to ask. I was reading a book by a female author when February hit, and that was Gwendolyn Kiste's Rust Maidens, and I was like, man, I gotta talk to this woman. So I went and read a bunch more of her books. I read or short stories and that. You're gonna see. So basically, my podcast kind of hijacked my YouTube reading schedule, and that's okay, because that's going to happen. But so at the beginning of the month, at the end of January, I started Thunderhead by Neal Shusterman, and I finished it in February, obviously, and I really enjoyed this book. I listened to these on audio, and let me tell you, I didn't want to stop. I wished that book 3 was out. I went from book 1 to book 2, this one. I just didn't stop, and I wanted to keep going. If there was a third one, there's a high chance that I would be listening to it right now, except for the fact that I'm doing the Wheel of Time books, and I'm kind of doing those on audiobook as well, and I'm reading them physically in the physical form as well. These ones I just sort of burnt through on audiobook. I didn't really read the books. I kind of leafed through them occasionally, but Thunderhead picks up pretty much where the first one left off, and if the first book was setting up the series, this one is really where the series finds its issues and things get really dark. This is like it's almost like the Empire Strikes Back type of book. It just has that sort of darkness, and it ends on a very dark note. I really recommend these books. They're young adult, sure, but the only thing that's missing from them really is the swear word, the cursing. They don't curse in these books, and there's no sex. There is a romance, though. The romance, I'm not big on romances unless they're done really well, and this one is done okay, but, I could do without it, to be honest. I really like the idea of the story, though, of becoming a world where death is no longer a threat to human life, and where we're all basically immortal because of science, and except, of course, we do have these people who become scythes, and they determine who dies instead of natural causes or car crashes or whatever. And it makes a lot more sense when you're reading it, and it's just a lot of fun. It really takes into account what it means to be alive, and I think that's something that we often forget. So yeah, definitely read that. I gave that, I think, 5 stars. I've been reading a lot of, it was funny, because at the beginning of the year, I was like, you know what, I'm going to be harder on my reviews. I used to give 5 stars like they were candy to children, like, here, 5 stars for everyone. But I wanted to be a little more hard. My wife doesn't give 5 stars. In fact, that's like a rule of hers when she's rating a book on Goodreads. She's like, I don't give 5 stars. I'm like, and she's like, no book is perfect. I'm like, I know, but what if I really enjoyed it? I get excited about a book. I know it has some flaws here and there.
I want to give it 5 stars.
And so I gave that 5 stars. I've been giving a lot of 5 stars. I should really I should toughen up. Yeah, stop getting excited. Alright, so, I also read Glass Slipper Dreams Shattered by Doungjai Gam. Now, I talked to her for the podcast because I was reading this book, and again, it was one of those where this is great. I want to talk to her. It's February, Women in Horror Month. Why not ask this woman? It's her first collection, and it's basically filled with a whole bunch of flash fiction mixed with some poetry here and there. And these stories they're not always horrific. The very first one is very horrific, and then there's some really nasty ones spread throughout, but a lot of them are emotional, and you sort of get a sense of, you don't get a sense, it's right there on the page, that this is real life, and these stories come from a very personal place from this author, and so I highly recommend you checking that out. It's kind of hard to discuss each story. I did actually have some snippets I wanted to read out, but this video was supposed to be shot 3 weeks ago, and I just didn't really want to get my notes organized that much. I just wanted to get some videos done. But I might return to that book at some point, maybe review it, and then I'll do some readings from it or something, because it's a gut punch. Some of those stories in there are real gut punches. I gave that a 5 stars as well. It shows a lot of promise for Doungjai Gam, and I can't wait to read her more. She's got something coming out in a couple of months, I think. I'm not too sure about that, but keep your eyes open for her. She's someone to watch out for. As I mentioned earlier, I read Rust Maidens by Gwendolyn Kiste, and I got to talk to her on the podcast as well. And I'm going to put the links down there for that, so you can check it out if you're interested. But she was a lot of fun to talk to. But this book, wow, The Rust Maidens. This is one of those stories that sort of slips into, I called it weird fiction, but you could also say it's like magic realism, because there's no monsters in it. The monster is, you could say, industry, manufacturing, because this book is set in it's not set in Detroit, it's set in Cleveland, and it's set in sort of like an industrial area of Cleveland, where the families live next to the big steel mill where everyone works. And one thing I really enjoyed about this novel, or novella, was that the word strike gets passed around, and people's blood turn cold. That's like the horror right there. And then when a strike is called, everyone is just scared out of their minds. And 5 little girls in this neighborhood start developing this weird condition where their bones are turning into rusted metal, and they're becoming kind of monstrous themselves. And it's very much a symbol of the Rust Belt, and what people manufacturing cars, or whatever, what it was like to live in these areas and grow up living with this cloud over your head, that you have this, your dad or whoever in your family has this job that pays well enough to keep your family where they are, in a house with food on the table, and you as a kid in school. But what if it's taken away? And so and of course it's taken from the perspective of I believe she's 18 years old, an 18-year-old young woman who's just about to graduate from high school, and it's just a very, very interesting read, and it's very dark at points, and there's a couple of scenes where actually had me kind of creeped out. It's not easy. There's only maybe a handful of books that I've read that have actually made me a little bit afraid, and there's a scene in this book that actually had me creeped out. So I highly recommend Rest Maidens. It was a lot of fun to read, and it made me think a lot. And just talking about it now, it's like it's getting the wheels turning again, even though they're rusty. See what I did there? All right, 5-star read, Rest Maidens. Definitely check that out if you haven't. And so, reading that and being completely blown away, I went on and read "And Her Smile Will Untether the Universe." That's by Gwendolyn Kiste also. This is her collection of short stories. It came out, I think this is her first release, and I could be wrong about that, because there's another novella of hers. I don't know if that came out before or after, but it doesn't matter. This is a collection of her short stories, and these stories are just wonderful. The writing in it is just, it's mind-blowing how good these stories are. And, being a writer, you read writers like Gwendolyn Kiste, and you wonder what the hell you're doing. Like, you should just pack up and go home, because there's no way you could ever be like that. But that's dangerous thinking. Don't think that way, writers. Just be yourself. That's the best advice any writer could give another writer, because imposter syndrome is a very evil fucking mind worm that will destroy any possibility of you becoming creative. Anyways, that's neither here nor there. Definitely check out "And Her Smile Will Untether the Universe" as well. It's a very awesome title, I think. And to finish off the theme of Women in Horror Month, I read a collection of poetry, and it's called "A Collection of Nightmares," and this is by Christina Singh. Now, this collection was pretty good. I was sold on a sample poem. I forget where I read it. It might have been on the Amazon itself. I don't know, but it was just the poem was so very horrific, and it just captured everything about, like, I think there's like a graveyard, and it was night, and the moon was full, and it was just awesome. So I was like, oh, I got to get this, and I bought it, and I read it, and it was a very quick read, and it turned out not to be quite like that, the way I perceived it. It ended up being very much a themed poetry book about aliens invading Earth and pretty much wiping out humanity. And there's times where you're like, wow, this, either the author's really pissed off at humanity or she was just running with it. Overall, I really enjoyed the poems in here, although not always, the poems didn't always work for me. It was kind of a new concept for me, the way these poems were presented, and I think that was, if I had any issue with it, it was that. I gave this 3.5 stars out of 5. That's a pretty good rating, I think. So that was the books I read in February, and I started reading a couple more things. I started reading Nothing is Everything by Simon Strantzas, because he reached out to me. He wants to be on the... he requested to be on the podcast, and I was like, yeah, sure. I mean, he wrote a foreword to Hidden Figures, Stephen Rasnick Thames' collection of... one of his more recent collections of short stories. He wrote the foreword to that, to Steve Rasnick Thames' collection. It's like, okay. So I went and started reading them, and the first story in this collection really touched me, and it was weird because I don't think it was meant to touch anyone, but it did touch me. It was very Black Mirror-esque. And the one thing I really enjoy about some of these stories, not all of them, but this one in particular, the setting is around the area where I've grown up. And that was a shock. I wasn't expecting that at all. I was talking to him about it on his Facebook Messenger. I mentioned that, and he was like, "Yeah, I kind of take liberties," which he does. Like he mentions a town that I live right by, and another town, and he's like, "In order to get there, you have to go north," when basically you actually have to go east, and or at least something like that, anyway. And I was like, "Yeah, I could tell that, you took liberties, but that's okay because the story itself." Just doesn't feel like it's grounded in our reality anyway. There's sort of like a Twilight feel to this story, where you're in this world, but you're not. It's like maybe like an alternate dimension where everything is slightly different and yet the same. And yeah, so you know what? The rest of the stories were good, but not as good as the first one. I felt first one really impressed me, and I'm going to be talking to him soon, hopefully, for the show. I also started No Mercy by Alessandro Manzetti. This is another collection of poetry because I want to get into poetry. I was talking to Alex Black about this on her channel. She was saying how much she wants to get into poetry, and I do too. I want to get into like more classic related poetry, like more well-known poetry. But I also want to. I also want to read within, the horror genre, the poetry that's being done there. And No Mercy, it won the Stoker a couple of years ago. So I feel this one is, it's kind of important for that reason alone. And I found it very fascinating that Alessandro, I believe he dedicated the book to, I can't remember her name. It's a singer. She died in like early 70s. But yeah, so I just wanted to see exactly what entails an award-winning collection of horror poetry. And so I was thinking of maybe starting to read some of the collections of horror poetry that have won in this category throughout the years, and maybe reading a lot of the collections that have been nominated this year. I think that would be a lot of fun. I also started my co-host, and I apologize for this being all Darkness Dwell centered, but I've decided I almost actually stopped doing the show because wasn't going anywhere. At least didn't seem to be. And but I was talking to Michael, and he was like, "You know what? If you really enjoy doing it, then and who cares if it's popular or not? Just keep doing it." So I was like, all right, I'll give it one more go. And I decided to put a lot more actually, effort into doing it. And so far the results have been actually pretty good. So here's hoping, right? That I don't find myself in that rut again where I feel like everything's just failing. But anyways, my co-host, Michael Schutz, he's finished it's actually his third novel. It's not published yet, but he wants me to beta read it for him, and so I started that. And I'm like dreadfully behind on everything I need to read. Dreadfully behind. So I need to like up my game and just sit down and start reading. All right. So also, obviously, I finished. Like early on in March, I finished Eye of the World by Robert Jordan, the first book of the Wheel of Time. And something interesting happened while I was reading it, and I'm finding that I'm enjoying it a lot more than I did the other two times I read it. I think the reason for that is because I think it's because I'm in a better place upstairs here for it. It's not that it's like a difficult read or anything. It's not, but I'm able to pull a little bit more from it. I find it funny actually when people say that Wheel of Time is sexist. I can see why people would say it's sexist. It's because you're looking at the small details. The small details of the book, especially the first one, show a lot of differences between men and women. But what a lot of people fail to see is that women are often in places of power. And they didn't get there because of men. They got there because that's just the way this world works. the women almost rule the place, and the men just follow. They grunt and they hate it. But, Robert Jordan is going to create a utopia where everyone's following whatever women say and with a smile on their face and yes, ma'am. That's not the way it would work. He's got realistic characters here. And there's another interesting dichotomy, I think, or at least contrast between, because the Wheel of Time is very much, good versus evil type of story. And I've always put good versus evil in sort of like a category where the characters can't be very realistic if it's going to be that way. But these characters are realistic. When you're in Emmons Field, it's just like being in the town I grew up in. I mean, this is the way people act. It's the way they are. And that's what Robert Jordan's pulling from. And because he obviously knows it too. And so, for whatever reason, I didn't notice those things before. It was just your typical chosen one, starting off as like, in his, he's in a farm field. He's and then he's going to be swept away, taken on a big adventure, and told that he's the chosen one. That's the basics of this story, but there's so much more happening, and there's so many things going on in this first book. I love it. I ranked it 4 stars from the last time I read it, and I can't even remember when that is. But I bumped it up to 5 stars because suddenly I'm noticing everything that's going on in it. I think part of the reason is I've been listening to a lot of podcasts about the books. The least spoiler ones, the best, because I've only made it up to... I finished book 7 last time around, so I don't want to know how it ends. I think I may have come across a spoiler accidentally on Twitter. I hope not. But because if it is, it's a big one. Anyway, so yeah, Eye of the World, and I went straight into the second one, The Great Hunt, and I'm listening to both those, as I said, on audio, but I'm also reading. I have those little, I forgot to bring them with me, but those little hard copies. I've decided to stop buying those, not because I don't like them. I actually love those little books, but price-wise, I mean, they're not that expensive, but I want to start collecting the actual hardcovers. So I'm going to have those instead. And I've ordered Eye of the World. It's on its way. I'll be showing that off at some point. All right, so that is my February-March wrap-up. Thanks if you've stayed this long. Thank you so much for sticking around. I got a lot of content I want to create soon. I just hope that I get the time, because when people say they don't have the time to do things, when it comes to creating YouTube videos, it's so much the truth, because you got to set up everything. You got to sit down. You can't be interrupted by kids or animals. Well, I guess animals are okay. But the kids is the worst one, because you got to get them out of the house, or at least get them in a different part of the house, and that's not always easy. All right, so please, if you liked what you saw here, hit like, subscribe, keep being creative, and I will see you again in the next bookish video.